Hello and welcome to the Gemini full moon reading. I just want to share my screen with you so I can show you exactly what that looks like. Okay, here we go. There we go. Okay, so this is on the 8th of December. And there's a few interesting things here that I want to point out. And just a reminder, I'm really trying to use these videos as tools to help you to learn about you and to reference it in your own life because, it's interesting in itself, I think. But if you then take that and personalize it by opening up your own chart, and remember, you can do this for free on astro.com or AstroSeek. This that I'm using is AstroSeek. I find it easier for the purposes of these videos, but when I do readings with people, I tend to use astro.com. So I use them both quite a lot. And what I find really interesting then is if you take it and you look at where is that in that place in my chart. And the place that we're looking at primarily at this full moon is 16 degrees. Here's the sun, 16 degrees. Let me just blow this up a minute. 16 degrees of Sagittarius. Opposite the moon at 16 degrees of Gemini, but look who's also there with the moon is Mars retrograde. So I've been speaking, in fact, if you listen to any astrology anywhere, you'll have been hearing about Mars retrograde in Gemini. Mars is the planet that can go retrograde, that does go retrograde the least often. So a Mars retrograde is always going to be quite impactful. Mars is also sometimes called a malefic, which makes him a challenging guy. So when we are looking at a challenging planet being really outside of his comfort zone because he likes to move forward and now he has to go backwards, it's super uncomfortable and it creates a lot of stuff for us. But what it also does is it forces us to slow down, which is exactly the opposite of what Mars wants to do, and rethink. Mars is about how we get things done. And now, obviously, in order to get things done, the sort of obvious, overt way to do that is to move towards them and do them, eat that frog, so to speak. But when Mars is retrograde, we feel like we're not getting things done. And I really think it's about the reframe of our own narrative here, because sometimes it's in the not doing that we are doing. Because in the not doing, things are incubating, ideas are brewing. And sometimes, especially for those of us who are quite Martian even, or strong with Aries, Scorpio, or even Leo and Sag planets that really like to go quite forcefully, those are the times where sometimes we do it before we leap before we look. And we rush at the project. I want to tackle it. I want to get it done. And if we're doing that, sometimes we haven't actually looked through all the fine print. And Mars retrograde gives us the opportunity to look through the fine print. And because the moon is here to meet him, and she moves pretty fast, so she's only going to just like go and tickle him and activate all that is coming up for you in this kind of irritating Mars and Gemini aspect. And also just remembering Mars and Gemini, because Gemini's twins and two ways of doing things, at least two ways of doing things. Mars is going backwards and he's going, well, I don't know, which way should I go? So he's having this opportunity to reflect, whereas normally you would say Mars moving forward, bulldozing through Gemini, he might start doing it one way and then go, damn it, I've done it wrong, and have to come back and do it another way. So he's doing it twice. Whereas now he has to reflect. There are two ways. Which way do you want to do it? And then when we go forward, he can do it that way because he's had that time to process. And obviously, this is not really about gender, but Mars is more of a masculine planet to Venus, who's more of a feminine planet. The moon is also more feminine, and she is coming in here to bring a little bit of her femininity into Mars's frustration. And so it's like cooling his fire a little bit, because he's like this built up pressure cooker right now. I'm going backwards and I'm slow. I'm not hitting my targets. I need to move forward, but he can't rush the process. And Moon comes here, and really Moon's message, because she does the whole wheel every single month or month. She goes around the whole wheel. She touches everybody. She's the fastest moving, and she's very grounding and embodying. She's cooling and soothing. She comes across and she activates him at her fullest So when she is at her brightest, at her most intense, at her most illuminating, and sometimes at her most lunatic-y, that's how the word lunatic-y is not a word, but that's where lunatic comes from, and lunacy, because at full moon, the emergency rooms are fuller with stupid accidents because people tend to be a bit more risk-takey and grandiose. Oh, I'm making up a lot of words here. It must be all this Gemini energy that I'm tuning into. So the risks tend to be higher at full moon because she is her biggest self. So she's theoretically coming across to cool the Martian energy down a little bit, but it could also be that he triggers some of her big feelings. And that's very much going to depend on what's going on within you and what work you've been doing to mitigate what's going on within you to see who triggers who. Does Moon manage to trigger Mars into calming down and tuning into his feeling and trusting his gut? Or does Mars manage to trigger Moon to go, yes, you're right, I'm so irritated, clench her jaw, get frustrated, get over emotional. 1 minute she's crying, 1 minute she's raging. That could happen too. Because of course that Gemini energy, that 2 ways, I can be so angry and then I can be so sad and then I can be so happy and then I can be so whatever. I'm going to say mad because it rhymes, but angry and mad are similar. So, we're just going to have to see how that unfolds for each of us. Now, if you have something at 16 degrees of Gemini or thereabouts, or 16 degrees of any of the other mutable signs, which would also be Sagittarius, which is where the sun is, or also Virgo or Pisces, then quite likely you're going to be a lot more triggered. And those will be the more challenging trigger points. If you have anything in 16 degrees of the other air signs, so Gemini is an air sign, or maybe we could say Libra or Aquarius, you're going to maybe have a more flowing, generous kind of energy from this moon. So my newsletter this month, if you read that, is a little bit about explaining the aspects. The aspects are the 120 degree, which is a trine, the 90 degree, which is a square. And obviously I bring these into every reading because what that is telling us is how the planets are talking to each other. Are they talking nicely or are they combative, argumentative, irritating? So if you have mutable sign, middle degrees of the mutable signs, it's going to be a little bit more irritating. Because if for example, you have your own Mars at 16 degrees of Gemini, your whole default Martian setting is going to be triggered by this moon in a big way. If you had Venus there, then that would be triggered. So if you have anything at 16 degrees, and you can look sort of 3 degrees on either side of that point, then it's just going to be more intense for you. Breathe through it and look at what comes up. Look at what gets triggered. Be curious. Gemini is super curious and interested. And if you can keep yourself in the observer, that witnessing consciousness, and just see what am I being triggered with, and then kind of sit back, journal. Gemini loves to journal. I'm a Gemini, so I can attest to this. Gemini loves to journal it, embody it. The moon loves us to get it down on paper, to get it in our bodies so that we can understand and metabolize better. So what's being triggered in me right now? And be interested, because until you can see those triggers and those patterns, you can't change them. And so this is where I think these uncomfortable, or some people would call them negative or malevolent, whatever, energies and aspects and whatnot actually are amazing if we are prepared to accept them for what they are, coming here to give us some kind of gift. And the quote, there's no comfort in the growth zone and there's no growth in the comfort. Well, oh my God, I can't even say it now. I'm having a real Gemini moment. There's no growth in the comfort zone and there's no comfort in the growth zone. If we can remember that, and if we can go, okay, well, if I'm uncomfortable, I must be growing, or I can put my head in the sand and go back into what's comfortable. Once you've opened your eyes and seen a pattern, though, it's very difficult to unsee that pattern, which I would view as a good thing, but I know pattern breaking can be really challenging. And even though I fully believe that it's for the best, I know in my own life, sometimes I just wish I weren't a pattern breaker and I could put my head back in the sand. So it can bring up a lot of those sorts of feelings. Then I also just wanted to point out that it's so interesting that Mercury, here's Mercury, is at the exact degree that the next new moon is at. So Mercury is actually the ruler of Gemini. So that whole narrative that's going on with Mars and Moon, while she's opposite the sun in Sagittarius. So we already have this like, full moon dynamic that we talk to every time, which is the moon opposite the sun point of the month. So there's already this pull between how do I stay safe in my neighborhood, moon, and how do I expand my horizons, sun, and moon wants to stay safe and sun wants to broaden out. And so there's a push-pull that way. Moon says, I just want to learn enough, because she's in Gemini, I just want to learn enough to make sure that I'm not bored and everything is I'm happy in my beginner mind. Sag Sun says, I would rather go to university and leave the province, the state, wherever you live. I want to step outside of my comfort zone. I want to expand my understanding. I don't want to keep it small. I don't want to stay in beginner mind. So there's already the dynamic of the Gemini Sag axis, which funnily enough, sorry, I didn't even speak too much into that. I jumped straight into the like intensity of Mars and the moon together. But of course, they're both, Mars and the moon are opposing the sun. So the same way that the sun and moon are pulling on one another, Mars is also pulling on sun. So that is obviously happening. And then Mercury is at the degree that the sun and moon will meet again. So when the moon, she's over here and she travels much faster. So in 2 weeks from the full moon, she's going to travel all the way around and she's going to be right here where Mercury is. And in that 2-week time, the sun is going to travel to here as well. So he's slower. He travels a degree a day. She travels like through one sign every 2.5 days. So the Mercury is how we think. So Mercury is there at the full moon and he's at that same degree point. So again, look at your chart. Do you have anything in the first few degrees of Capricorn? Because Mercury is coming in there with this narrative. And a lot of the narrative that he has on that day is going to be influencing the moon and Mars who are in Gemini. And maybe even a little bit influenced by the moon and the Mars who are in Gemini, because you can imagine that the moon and Mars are staying over at Mercury's house, but Mercury's not at his house, but they're in his house. So everything in his house is decorated the way that he decorates things. And maybe that is something that Moon or Mars like, and maybe it's not. So they've got to kind of be comfortable outside of their own home. In the meantime, Mercury is traveling. He's just gotten into the sign of Capricorn, which is quite far from his own home, but he knows that he has an influence over sun and moon and Mars. But in the meantime, he's also maybe a little concerned, like, what are Moon and Mars doing in his house? And did they pay their rent if they're in an Airbnb? So they're all influencing one another. Now, with Mercury in that first degree of Capricorn, which is where the next new moon is going to be, he's sitting there and he's going, okay, so let me think about this in a Capricorn way. Let me tell the story in a Capricorn way. How do I sober up, because Saturn rules Capricorn, like sober up my thinking, sober up my planning. And obviously we're coming out of the jubilant Jupiter ruled Sagittarius sign. Now we have to rein it in. And Mercury's going, okay, woof, I've got to rein it in. I better collect the rent, for example, from Moon and Mars. And as he's doing that, he's paving the way with our thinking process first before sun and moon get there. And then there will be an echo of a similar thing because Mercury just had this conversation there that was very tied into the full moon, which is already very engaging between sun and moon. So again, this new full moon in Gemini feels like there's going to be a strong echo of something that happens. And we have to really stay in witnessing mindset here and observe, because it's likely to be a little nuanced and subtle, so that when we get 2 weeks hence to the next new moon, and we're going to drop in, I think that's the 23rd of December, then we're going to drop in and go, oh, I know what's happening here. And we're going to feel something deeper. And usually what happens is it helps us to resolve and mitigate and balance out. So what happens is every sign balances out the one that went before it. There's a bit of a corrective quality. So we're coming out of the whoa, wild and loud Sagittarius season into a lot more sober and somber Capricorn season, which is what we need to do by the time we get out of Sagittarius. However, when we were in Scorpio season prior to Sagittarius, we got so deeply entrenched and ensconced and emotional, and just it was eking and digging. We desperately needed to correct that intense emotional dive with the joyful, jubilant Sag, which is where we still are for this video, for this full moon. So you can see that none of them are right or wrong. They all just give us the reprieve. They lead into one another. They correct the one before, but they also have their own shadow, and the next one will correct that, but it also has its own shadow, and so we go. So that's really important. And then there's also, in my newsletter, I spoke about the 5 Ptolemaic aspects, but I just wanted to show you a couple of little irritating ones that are not part of those aspects. They're a little bit more subtle, but I added this aspect line there, so they're green. And this is a quincunx between Uranus, who's been so like intense in the last 2 years, 2021, 2022 particularly, but even sort of coming in a little bit at the end of 2020. This Uranus shakeup, and of course the eclipse season that we just left behind us in Taurus Scorpio, because the node will be at 13 degrees and Uranus will be at 15 degrees, only 1 degree off the sun at 100. So different sign. They don't see each other as clearly as the aspects that I mentioned to you. In fact, they can't see each other, but they irritate each other. So this is an aspect, I don't want to get too deeply into it, but it's like irritating. It's like the peripheral vision. You know somebody is watching you, you know somebody is judging you or whatever, but when you turn, you can't see them. It's always in the peripheral vision. And Uranus, this full moon, has got this really interesting and irritating peripheral vision vibe. He's also, so he's 150 degrees from the sun, but he's 30 degrees, which is also right beside me. It's like, it's kind of like the hidden enemy. You know, the person you thought was your friend who was standing there for backup, that was actually, and I'm going to use the word gossiping because Gemini has a strong gossip energy, actually gossiping about you behind your back, and something shocking doesn't quite come to light, but it's right there. It's almost like you know that somebody else knows the secret, but you can't prove it and you don't know how they know, and it was the person standing right beside you. So that's how Uranus is kind of impacting these guys. And this is more the like peripheral vision, sort of like I just can't understand what's going on here. So that's a little bit of an irksome and irritating energy that's coming through in this full moon as well. So, I mean, there's so many other things I would love to jump into, because there's just always so much to look at in a chart, but I think let's just try to keep it to the bigger energies, the more simple ones that we can look at. Oh, one more thing I did want to mention is that Venus is in the last degrees of Sagittarius. So she's at 27 degrees, and Sag is a mutable sign. She is squaring Jupiter, and they are the two benefic. So you would say that, or you could say, and I like this because it gives you an understanding, but don't take it to the point where it becomes all hellfire and damnation. But you would say that Saturn and Mars are malefic, the malevolent planets. They're much more challenging for the most part. And you would say that Jupiter and Venus are your benefic. They're much more beneficial. Saying that, they can bring their own storm, and you can really be saved by Mars and Saturn on many a level. So it's not black and white, and it very much depends what it says in your personal natal chart. That will give a lot more indication. But right now, Jupiter is at his final degree of Pisces, and you might remember that he moved into Aries and then he's backtracked into Pisces, and he's actually on his way back to get back into Aries, and then he'll be done with Pisces. So he's in his last like days in Pisces for 12 years, because he's a 12-year cycle. So he's not getting back to Pisces for 12 years. And he's in that intense 29-degree point, which is that sign in its biggest, wildest, most intense shadow and light. And Venus is squaring him. So the two benefic planets are pushing each other's buttons. They're pushing each other's buttons. What does that feel like in you. Jupiter wants to dream the big dream. He's right next to Pisces. He's quite idealistic and excessive. And Venus in Sag, she can be excessive too. I mean, there could be a like, have we partied too hard over the December season, and have we made some dubious choices? And who's pushing who, and who's encouraging who to transform? And that very much, again, depends on what's happening in your natal chart and how it's manifesting for you. So that's also quite a big energy. And I say big, like intentionally, because Jupiter is big. He always makes everything bigger. When it's full moon time, everything is bigger as well, because the full moon enhances everything that's going on. So there is some big stuff coming up, and it's about you looking at where does that big stuff show up in my life, and how can I manage myself better without judgment, but just look at, do I need to let go a little bit more? Do I need to hold on a little bit more? Do I need to calm that part down and encourage that part of myself? And the first thing is just to observe, to watch yourself, to witness yourself, to try and not judge yourself too harshly, but try and find that corrective quality in you to correct yourself when you feel that you're going off track. And you are the best judge of yourself. Always you are the best judge of yourself, because you have this, and that's also that peripheral kind of energy, is like, you feel uncomfortable. You have that gut feel that I don't like how I handled that situation. I think I made the wrong choice. And those are the times that, you know, there's another choice. You can change direction. You can change how you do things. So it's very important to remember, let me stop this share, that you are only in charge of you. And there is always another way, especially when we're dealing with Gemini, we're dealing with Sag, we're dealing with Pisces, we're dealing with mutables. The mutables are much more available to accepting the fact that, sure, I don't think I handled that well. How can I fix it? There is another way. Sometimes the fixed signs, they get too fixed in their way, but mutable gives you that opportunity to be kinder to yourself and to correct what you need to correct. So I hope this has been helpful. And I would love it if you comment, like, share, subscribe, follow, all of those things. And remember that I am available for readings. So if you are interested in that, please get in touch. The link will be in the bio. And I'm sending so much love and support over this festive season, and also for this full moon. Thank you very much for watching. And I will be back with the new moon reading in a few weeks.